What I wanted to talk about today, in fact, connects directly to the discussion we started 2 days ago about the question of regulation and to what extent it exists. It actually exists in all the professions that we know. So I would like to share with you some of my thoughts about this question, with a specific reference to the field of translatorial practices. And I hope, after hearing Christopher and Janet this morning, I hope I may be able to resonate at least a little with what you said. And I'm sorry, I have to use my papers in order not to exceed too much the time limit. So what I do is a culture analysis, and therefore my interest in professions lies in that they constitute very important, in my view, very important cultural fields where individuals construct their identity and compete for recognition and control of whatever they have to do. And in this sense, professionalism has been recognized as the ultimate measure, in that it, as we all know, it formalized types of knowledge and skills that can be legally sanctioned to the point that they determine the canon and legacy of a profession. In other words, we can look at professionalism as a mechanism of distinction, and I'm using here the conceptual framework of Pierre Bourdieu, the sociologist, a distinction that guarantees not only the boundaries of an occupation, but also hierarchies between top specialists and less qualified or amateurs, less qualified workers or amateurs. The idea is to get as remote as possible from an anyone can do it occupation. So in line with this theory of Pierre Bourdieu and his notion of symbolic economy, scholars have already noted that this notion of pure professionalism is in fact normative. It is a powerful image that some actors promote as their exclusive symbolic capital, so as to secure their autonomy as producers. Yet in reality, as we do know, as we just discussed, this apparatus in its strict sense is confined to certain paradigmatic professions, notably medicine, law, engineering maybe, and even there practice is not always consistent with the formal rules, and tensions are often at play between highly codified proficiencies and marginal options of practicing, like these between biomedical and alternative therapy, or the one we discussed the day before between medical and traditional midwifery. And examples are many. Whereas in many other occupational occupations, this mechanism is at best a wishful thinking. Often training and accreditation are not obligatory if they exist at all, so that knowledge and skills are hardly formalized, to the extent that the distinction between professionals and natural workers is blurred. Now, this situation is usually discussed with reference to emerging or hybrid occupations, where it may be conceived as a transitory embryonic phase in the evolution of a profession. But in many other semi-professional settings, including traditional long-standing ones, such as translation or childcare, to mention the two that I have done some work on, professionalization is persistently suspended. Scholars usually see this fact as detrimental and often look for ways to solve this problem. But this may seem so only if we stick to this classical view that professionalism is the ultimate generator of status. In contrast, I embrace the view that this is not the only, perhaps not even the major way by which practitioners achieve status and define their expertise. And therefore, precisely those cases of so-called failed professionalization seem very revealing for the cultural logic of occupations and proficiencies. So I take translators as a perfect example because of their enduring ambiguous status. On the one hand, translation and interpreting, so both written and oral, have always been in high demand and much respected for their intercultural mediation function, especially today, when globalization is a buzzword, but always. And still, they permanently lie on this gray zone of semi-professions. While theories of translation proliferate in the academic sphere, there is a discipline called translation studies. They are hardly obligatory for practicing in this field, where diploma is seldom demanded. The market is flooded by unqualified workers who mostly work as freelancers, often as part-time job, without formal ranks and without standards and of work and pay. Now, although in certain sectors, attempts to professionalize do accelerate today, overall the impact, as much as I can tell, is still scant. Apart from these certain sectors, the status of translation as a whole resembles that of service or care jobs, or even natural crafts such as cooking, gardening, or whatever, where the best practice is constructed by social learning, and membership remains largely a matter of informal social control. Obviously, whether or not professionalization occurs depends on market incentives and government interest. But as historians tell us, the major impetus must come from the practitioners themselves, who strive to capitalize on their specific abilities. So my contention here would be that more than institutional tools, the autonomy of an occupation depends on the cultivation of an effective ethos by the workers, an ethos that may or may not mobilize them to professionalization. My analysis of this field is based on two studies I conducted in Israel, in which I wanted to get a closer look at the perspective of the practitioners, how they understand their proficiency and the notion of professionalism. Since in Israel, translation is not even registered as a profession, nor is it regulated by effective professional bodies. There are no data about this occupation. I use evidence from the written media as well as a large corpus of 95 in-depth, very long individual interviews with translators. And this large corpus was compiled in a joint project I conducted with my late colleague Miriam Schlesinger. Well, the material is enormous and um, still far from being exhausted. Now, to start showing a bit of my analysis, let me begin by one quotation, which is very typical. And this lady translator tells me, there is some plastic factory, so usually the girl who makes the orders speaks Russian, and she's the secretary there. And usually she tells me that she does the translations, just ordinarily. But sometimes she just overloaded with work, so I do it. But I don't mind so much. They are nice. And this is a very typical quotation, because overall, the picture that emerges is that translators are chronically threatened by the image of an unspecified proficiency of a natural translator who does it in everyday circumstances without the ambition to pursue a career in translation. Such natural translators are countless. They may be secretaries in commercial firms, they may be students who do ad hoc translating. They are often members of underprivileged groups, mainly immigrants, who find themselves translating for relatives or clients in encounters with officials. All these people have the basic ability to translate, which, according to linguist Brian Harris and other people, amounts to no more than an innate verbal skill. In contrast, translators who do it for a living must secure a distinctive expertise as their recognized symbolic capital. So the question is how they do it. And I want to say my argument in advance. What I found is that instead of confronting this image of a natural translator, those who aspire to be recognized as professionals idealize this image and strive to monopolize it as their own symbolic resource. Apparently, instead of formal knowledge and skills, they feel they must demonstrate personal traits to prove their fitness to this job. So obviously my view here, my approach here is quite Goffmanian. As Goffman said, in order to be able to play the game and get credit for it, one must learn to be the kind of a person that is idealized as the worthy worker in their profession. And this kind of know-how obviously goes beyond a definable proficiency and actually consists of an envisioned professional identity which determines the reputation and achievements of a legitimate worker. What struck me the most was that while in most cases professionalism is promoted by expert elites, in translation it is precisely an elite group that prevents professionalization. And this became very clear when I surveyed publications about translators that existed in cultural magazines and supplements in Israel throughout several decades. And I discovered that despite their ambiguous status, some dozens, like 35 or 40, famous literary translators demonstrate a strong sense of personal agency as individuals. And as I have elaborated previously, these personas play by what Pierre Bourdieu calls the rules of art, which entail a different ethos that of art producers. Even if they are paid for their work, they invoked the ethics of disinterestedness, which denies all forms of economic and practical considerations and claim instead artistic license. And whether or not this is true, but this one of these prima donnas said, when I identify with the writer, I want to translate whether they pay me or not. So their vision of the ultimate translator is that of a virtuoso who repeats the process of creation. They do not believe in a theory of translation at all, and they always feel that what they do is a mission impossible for an average person. Therefore, they also reject standard training and praise instead autodidactic self-refinement, where skills and methods are obscured by the notions of inspiration and creativity. So eventually, what makes one a competent translator in the eyes of these people is only a special blend of personal traits, that is talent, intuition, and intellectual sensibilities. And this obviously entails a strong sense of vocation, a calling. In their narrative of becoming, the competency to translate naturally evolves from an inner urge from childhood. They often describe a revelation point early in life in which inborn abilities magically, and they use this term, magically find expression with such strong effect that from then on one becomes addicted to it. Obviously, this also entails a strong, this also includes an assumed social role, either as guardians of culture or as culture brokers, or sometimes both. In the former case, they capitalize on a profound knowledge of the domestic language and culture and take the mission of educating the readers, whereas in the latter case, they underline cosmopolitanism and they feel as ambassadors of cultures who must salvage the domestic culture from provincialism and set new trends. Now, this discourse is distinctly promoted by a very small group of acclaimed translators who are also recognized actors in the literary field, where they usually also act as writers, critics, editors, even university professors. And by virtue of this high position, they also enjoy the visibility of intellectual personas in the public sphere at large. So in this sense, they are part of what Bourdieu calls a small-scale field of cultural production, where producers and consecrating agents interact and jointly construct their symbolic capital with their back to the public, to public demands or public taste. Thereby, they claim autonomy and also perform gatekeeping functions. Elite translators are very much aware, very much conscious of drawing the line between themselves and the masses of just ordinary translators, whom they actually deny the status of real translators and call them mere technicians of words, so that this powerful self-image provides the logic of divide by which elite translators form a field apart from all the other sectors of translation. I want to suggest that this artization logic may be even more forceful than professionalism in securing hierarchy and closure, precisely in mystifying the standards and the channels of learning, so that the imputed expertise remains entirely a question of identity. Now, in contrast to this small group of star translators, the majority of non-elite translators are anonymous workers who have no autonomous field of their own. Their jobs vary in media and formats between translating all types of texts, be they commercial, technical, scientific, even popular literature, through film or TV subtitling, which is very strong in Israel, to various forms of oral interpreting. And since usually, I'm going to show you one table, since usually a single worker performs more than one job type at a certain given period of time, apart from certain small niches, notably conference and sign language interpreting, it turns out that specialization is not the name of the game in this case. Since usually practitioners move between the different spheres of their work, they have no common platform for creating a distinct sense of vocation and establish the rules of their work. So that when they have to reflect on their profession, they are usually unable or maybe reluctant to define their own symbolic assets, and in most cases they betray profound ambivalence. In fact, it seems to me that the only available model of a dignified practitioner that serves them as source of inspiration is that of the elite literary translators. Yet they are very mindful of the gap between this aspiring vision and what they actually do for a living. So let me now indicate briefly a few points. As I said, overall, they are very careful not to sound too aspiring, and in fact, they emphasize the constraints they must comply with, so that their narrative of becoming is typically demystified and unfocused. It is a story of one thing leads to another, in which translation comes as only one of many other opportunities that may fit, however, insufficiently their basic abilities as well as pragmatic considerations. And still, as indecisive they often sound, they do betray what they feel are essential personal dispositions for a professional translator. And for example, they usually talk about the pragmatic benefits of flexible working hours and spaces, especially for young mothers among them. But at the same time, they would also imply the moral advantages they expect from this job, such as freedom and individualism. As this translator, for instance, says, it suits me very much, both on account of the baby and me, my nature. Some of them even say that they make concessions in earning because of their special character, which is not that of a business-oriented kind, like the one who says, don't get me wrong, it's not impossible to make money. It's only that I don't have the right personality for this. Along this line, while they are concerned about work conditions and fees, these people reject regulations that could have actually secure their condition. Most of these translators are not members of the Translators Association that does exist in Israel, although it is a very weak body with no jurisdiction. Sometimes they are not even aware of its existence. Nor can they specify a necessary training. They usually have academic education in the humanities and the social or the social sciences, but not necessarily in translation studies. And although diploma programs do exist, and as well as extra academic workshops, and they often attend these workshops, these programs hardly feature as a milestone in their stories. So eventually, these translators downplay, if not ignore, the potential of professionalization as an added value to their status. Consequently, these people are usually unable to define their expertise. Some of them mentioned virtues that are expected from service givers, such as punctuation, reliability, even technical literacy, as well as modesty and good communication with the clients. But above all, they emphasize the most basic ability of a natural translator, which is the linguistic competency. Apparently, talent for foreign languages is what they see as their supreme resource. And in fact, when they speak about it, they even use similar vocabularies as that of the vocational discourse of those privileged elite literary translators, as the one who says, as the one who says, it comes from a natural gift for language. It is my attraction to languages. And then she speaks about her childhood and her dream to learn French and so on. But at the same time, they are also conscious that they are also aware that knowing the language alone is insufficient for claiming professional expertness, especially in an immigration country such as Israel, when the most common foreign languages, which are English and Russian, are concerned. Just command of languages may appear trivial unless one demonstrates elaborate sensibilities beyond these of the common speakers. But as much as they try to show it, they do not provide a coherent idea of their advantage as qualified translators, even in terms of language expertise. And I will read this example because, again, it's very typical. And when this translator was asked what would be in her mind a good, what is demanded from a good translator, she was not able to give an answer, and she started by a perfect command of the languages, but they should be languages that you think with, not just languages that you know very well. And of course, command not just of the language, but also its grammatical rules, the tongue, and I mean, she was hesitating, a sort of literary sensitivity, a way, an ability to express yourself, not just to translate like a dictionary, to feel the language. And the final point is that, well, there is no doubt that the work of commercial and technical translators has by far immediate consequences for everyday life than that of literary translators. And yet, these individuals hesitate to claim the role of cultural brokers. Even if some of them do reveal artistic aspirations, at best they present them as a fantasy or a hobby, and draw a clear line between their true passion and what they have to do for a living, like the one who says, I don't do unpaid work unless it is poetry translation, which I do for myself. Similarly, they disclaim the title of cultural mediators. They usually avoid it, but if they are asked to specifically to comment about this powerful image. They usually acknowledge it but deny its relevance for their own personal experience. Now, this kind of identity compliance is especially obvious among the so-called second-ranked literary translators who do translate popular literature, and they do it for a living but with no prospect of joining the club of the highbrow translators. And nevertheless, despite or precisely because of this marginal position, they are more inclined to invoke artistic aspirations, even if only by way of negation. In fact, they would often assert that their work is a kind of creation. But at the same time, they emphasize their frustration because of what they see as a humble position that they have vis-à-vis the publishers. And they often talk about lack of personal agency in the text production industry. So just by way of summary, I want to make these 3 points. First, it emerges that while translators are very much aware of rebutting the status of anyone can do it occupation, the imputed expertise or proficiency relies entirely on the identity work of the practitioners. Instead of rational, bureaucratized professionalism in its classical sense, the worthy workers are recognized by the natural competencies. Eventually, obscuring professional competencies is precisely the powerful way of claiming professional autonomy and determining the hierarchy within this field. Now, second, as unstructured as this field seems, it is still unified by a sense of market of symbolic goods, and I'm using again the terminology of Pierre Bourdieu. While this artisanization ethos is nurtured as a means of exclusion by a small group of elite translators, its rules are accepted across the board by the masses of practitioners despite their insecure status. And given that the lower ranked literary translators are often the same people who also do these miscellaneous jobs of interpreting and translating, this undifferentiated cadre serves, although with ambivalence, as effective transmitters of this artisanization ethos across this occupation. And the last point is obviously that similar dynamics is also common in every occupation, including the highly professionalized ones, where it often creates an alternative to formal hierarchies. However, in the domain of translation, as well as other semi-professional fields, it appears as the only status generator, one that provides the actors with an occupational dignity without committing to institutional regulations. That's it. Thank you.